The market went silent. All at once, every voice stopped mid-word. Chidera did not need to look up. She already knew why. The wind had lifted her headscarf, just for a moment, just long enough. One streak of silver hair, bright against black, catching the sun like something that didn't belong to this world. A stranger's horse reared behind her. A man's voice, sharp with command, called for the convoy to halt. She turned, bracing for the same fear she'd known her whole life. Instead, an old woman in fine robes was already climbing down from a palanquin, hand pressed to her mouth, eyes fixed on that one streak of silver, as though she'd seen a ghost walk into the daylight. "Say your mother's name," the old woman whispered. "Say it now." 18 years earlier, Chidera was born on the night of the Harmattan winds, when dust turned the sky the color of old bone, and the midwives said later that even the fire in the birthing hut had guttered strangely, as if startled. Her mother did not survive the birth. Neither did anyone in the village of India think to question why, exactly, a healthy young woman had bled out so fast, or why the midwife who attended her, Mama Osioma, packed her bags and left India within the month, and never spoke of that night again to anyone who asked. What they did notice, what everyone noticed, within the first hour of Chidera's life, was the single streak of pure silver-white hair running through her scalp, stark against the black. A spirit mark, someone said before the baby had even been washed. Touched, said another. By morning, half the village had already decided what they believed about the infant girl before she'd taken 100 breaths of India air. Chidera's father, a quiet farmer named Eminaik, did not believe in spirit marks. He held his daughter through that first terrible night of grief and fear, and he told her, though she was far too young to understand any of it, that whatever the silver meant, it was hers and no one else's business. In the few years he had with her, he made a small ritual of it every evening. Before sleep, he would run his rough farmer's hand once over the silver streak and say the same short blessing. His own mother had once said over him, "May what makes you different be the very thing that saves you." Chidera did not understand the words as a child. She only understood the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of his voice, and she held on to both long after she'd lost any clear memory of his face. He did not live to see her grow much past her 5th year. A hunting accident took him during the dry season, a fall from a ridge, a broken leg gone bad with infection in a village 3 days from the nearest real healer. By the time help came, it was already too late. Chidera went to live with her grandmother, Mama Ninkoyo, the only family left willing to take her in. Mama Ninkoyo's compound was small, 2 rooms and a covered cooking area, modest even by India's ordinary standards. But she kept it scrupulously clean, and on Chidera's first night there, she did something no one else in the village had thought to do since the girl's birth. She sat her down, uncovered the silver streak herself with careful hands, and simply looked at it, turning Chidera's head gently side to side in the lamplight, the way someone might examine a piece of unusual but genuinely beautiful cloth. "I don't see a curse," she said finally. "I see hair, very striking hair. The rest is other people's fear, and fear is not yours to carry just because they've decided to hand it to." It was the first time since her father's death that anyone had looked directly at the mark without flinching, and Chidera, 5 years old and still raw with grief, cried harder in that moment than she had at either of her parents' funerals. Not from sadness this time, but from the sheer unfamiliar relief of being looked at plainly. The first time, another child called her spirit mark to her face. She was barely 6 years old, too young to fully understand the insult, old enough to understand the tone. A boy named Obina, showing off for a cluster of friends near the stream, had snatched her water gourd and held it just out of reach. "I don't want to drink after you," he said, wrinkling his nose in an exaggerated performance for his friends. "My mother says your kind spoils water just by touching it." Chidera had said nothing. She had simply waited, silent, until he grew bored of the game and dropped the gourd in the dust, rather than hand it back. And then she picked it up herself, rinsed it at the stream alone, and walked home without a word to anyone. It was the first of what would become, over the following decade, several thousand small humiliations exactly like it, each one small enough on its own to seem hardly worth mentioning, all of them together forming the entire architecture of her childhood. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Mama Nkoyo was old, even then, older than most grandmothers in India, with a quiet, watchful way of moving through the world that some mistook for coldness and others mistook for wisdom. She loved Chidera fiercely, in the practical, unshowy way of women who had buried too many people to waste time on softness that didn't also feed a child or mend a roof. But even Mama Nkoyo's love could not undo 5 years of whispered fear that had already hardened into something like village law by the time Chidera came to live under her roof. The other children were the first to make it plain. They would not sit near her at the learning circle beneath the odora tree. They would not share water from the same gourd. When Chidera reached for a ball rolling toward her feet during a game, the other children would simply stop playing and drift away, as though the ball itself had become something better left untouched. Chidera learned faster than any child should have to keep the silver streak hidden beneath a scarf whenever she could, and to keep her eyes down whenever she couldn't. The whispers might have stayed whispers, might have softened into background noise the way most childhood cruelties eventually do, if not for what happened the year Chidera turned 9. A sickness moved through India that dry season, nothing unusual in itself. Fevers came and went the way they always had, but this one took 3 children in the space of a month, all under the age of 6, and grief has a way of demanding somewhere to point itself when it has nowhere else to go. The village elders called for Dibia Okoro, the region's most respected diviner, a man whose word carried the weight of both spiritual and practical authority in a dozen villages beyond India's borders. Dibia Okoro arrived with his staff and his cowrie shells and his reputation, and after 3 days of rituals conducted in front of the anxious, grieving village, he cast his shells one final time in the center of the market square, in front of nearly everyone Chidera had ever known. The square had gone completely quiet for the casting, the way it does when an entire community holds its breath together, waiting for someone else to tell them what to be afraid of. Chidera stood near the back, with Mama Nik, her scarf pulled carefully over her hair as it always was on days when strangers visited, feeling the specific dread of a child who has learned, without ever being told outright, that certain kinds of attention are never good. "There is a mark among you," Dibia Okoro announced, his voice carrying over the silent crowd, rising and falling with the practiced cadence of a man who had delivered many such pronouncements in many such villages. "A child born wrong, under wrong stars, carrying something not meant for this world. Where sickness cannot be explained, look first to what should not exist." He did not say Chidera's name. He did not have to. Every eye in the market turned, slowly, unmistakably, toward the 9-year-old girl standing frozen beside her grandmother, her scarf having slipped just enough, in that exact terrible moment, to reveal the silver streak she'd spent a year learning to hide. Mama Nkoyo stepped in front of her granddaughter immediately, her spine straight, her voice sharper than Chidera had ever heard it. "This child has done nothing but grieve her own parents. You will not make her carry your fear as well." Dibia Okoro did not argue with her directly. Men of his standing rarely needed to. He simply gathered his shells, accepted his payment from the village elders, and moved on to the next village on his circuit, leaving behind a verdict that would outlast his visit by 17 years. But a diviner's word, one spoken in front of a frightened village, does not simply undo itself because one old woman objects. From that day forward, Chidera was not simply an unlucky orphan with strange hair. She was officially, formally, a mark upon India, a thing to be watched, blamed, and kept at arm's length. The sickness passed within the month, the way sicknesses generally do. No one in India ever publicly reconsidered what Dibia Okoro had said that day in the market. It is easier, it turns out, to let a verdict stand than to admit a whole village frightened itself over nothing. Mama Nkoyo's small trading stall, which had fed the two of them reasonably well for years, began losing customers who no longer wished to purchase cloth from a household marked by a diviner's warning. The two of them grew leaner, quieter, more alone. The change was gradual enough that Chidera almost didn't notice it happening in real time. A regular customer who simply stopped coming. A neighbor who no longer waved, "Good morning." An invitation to a naming ceremony that had always included them before, quietly not extended this particular year. By the time Chidera was old enough to understand what was happening, the isolation had already hardened into simple, unremarkable fact. the water she and her grandmother now swam in without remembering there had ever been a different current. Mama Koyo never once complained about it in front of her granddaughter, though Chidera would sometimes wake at night to the quiet sound of her grandmother recounting coins by lamplight, doing the careful arithmetic of a household that had lost most of its customers through no fault of its own. Chidera hummed sometimes, the way children do when the world outside their own head has stopped being safe, though she couldn't have said where the habit came from, since her grandmother didn't hum and she had no memory of her mother's voice at all. There was, in those years, exactly one small mercy. Maman Koye never once let the village's fear enter their own compound. Inside their 2 small rooms, Chidera was simply a granddaughter, teased gently for oversalting the soup, praised for a well-woven cloth, scolded for staying up too late by the fire. It was a narrow strip of ordinary life, but Chidera would later say it was the single thing that kept her from believing, all the way down to the bone. Everything the village outside their gate seemed so certain was true about her. If Dibia Okoro had given the village a reason to fear Chidera, it was Adama, a sharp-tongued trader 2 stalls down from Maman Koyo, who made certain that fear never had the chance to fade. Adama had disliked Maman Koyo since long before Chidera's birth, over an old dispute about market space that had calcified into a permanent, low-grade hostility neither woman had ever bothered to resolve. The diviner's pronouncement handed Adama a weapon she had clearly been waiting years to use. "Have you noticed," Adama would say to any customer who lingered near her stall, "how the rains have been strange since that girl came of an age to walk the market alone?" She never quite accused Chidera outright. That would have been too obvious, too easily challenged. She simply planted small doubts in the minds of people already primed by Dibia Okoro's words to look for confirmation of what they'd already decided to believe. By the time Chidera was 12, the story had grown well beyond anything Adama had originally said. Villagers now quietly blamed the silver-haired girl for a lame goat, a cracked well, a husband's wandering eye, problems that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a village that had found it easier to fear one child than examine its own ordinary misfortunes. The clearest example came the season a fire took hold of a neighboring family's grain store, destroying most of what they'd stored for the coming months. Adama was among the first to arrive at the smoking ruin, and among the first to loudly wonder, in front of the gathered crowd, whether anyone had seen that girl near the grain store recently. No one had. In fact, Chidera had been at her grandmother's stall the entire afternoon, as a dozen customers could easily have confirmed. But the question itself was the point. Adama did not need proof. She needed only to plant the association loudly enough, often enough, that the village's collective memory would eventually blur the difference between accusation and fact. "I was nowhere near it," Chidera said quietly. When the rumor reached her within the week, the closest she had come in years to publicly defending herself. "Ask anyone. I was grinding cassava the whole afternoon." "I'm sure you were," Adama replied, with a thin smile that suggested the opposite, loud enough for the customers at her own stall to hear. "Strange things follow you regardless, don't they?" "That's rather the point, isn't it?" Tiara Chidera bore all of it the way she'd learned to bear everything. Quietly, with her scarf pulled low, her eyes on the ground, her chores done twice as carefully as anyone else's in some unspoken hope that flawlessness might eventually earn her the belonging her existence apparently forbade. Adama made sure of that, refining her campaign with the patient cruelty of someone who had found, in a 9-year-old's misfortune, an outlet for decades of unrelated resentment. The particular cruelty of it was that Chidera's work was, by any honest measure, exceptional. She wove cloth faster and finer than girls twice her age. She could calculate a fair trade price in her head faster than most adult traders, a skill she'd developed simply from years of watching her grandmother Estal lose customers and quietly trying to compensate through sheer competence. Visitors passing through India who didn't know the local gossip would sometimes remark, admiringly, on the unusually skilled young weaver at the modest stall near the market's edge, comments that Adama made certain never traveled far or lasted long. Once the visitors moved on, and the village's usual verdict reasserted itself. "Cursed girl," children would murmur when Chidera passed, some of them too young to even remember why the word had first attached itself to her. simply repeating what they'd absorbed from parents who repeated what they'd absorbed from Adama's careful, relentless whispering campaign. Mama Nkoyo grew thinner and more tired with each passing year, though she never once let Chidera see her waver, never once suggested that the girl she'd raised was anything other than exactly who she should be. When Chidera was 15, a traveling herbalist named Mama Dago began passing through Ndia twice a season, selling remedies and setting bones and treating the ailments the village's own limited healing knowledge couldn't handle. Mama Adogo was, by nature, a woman who paid attention to things other people had trained themselves not to see. She noticed, within her first visit, that the girl everyone in India seemed to walk carefully around was, in fact, the most competent young hand at the market, the one who ground herbs finest, who could identify a fever's true cause faster than most adults, who moved through the world with a careful precision that suggested a mind far sharper than her circumstances had ever been permitted to reflect. "You have good hands," Mama Adogo told her plainly, the first time she watched Chidera help bind a child's broken wrist without flinching or hesitating. "And a good eye. Where did you learn this?" "Nowhere," Chidera said, startled by the plain, unafraid way the woman addressed her. "I only watch and try to help when I can." The clearest proof of Chidera's growing skill came when a farmer's son fell, badly ill with a fever that had already claimed one child that season and showed every sign of following the same path. Mama Dogo was 3 villages away, unreachable in time, and it was Chidera who identified the specific combination of cooling leaves and reduced feeding that broke the fever by morning, when the boy's own family had already begun preparing for the worst. For exactly 1 week, the village's memory of Dibia Okoro's warning wavered. The boy's grateful mother spoke openly of Chidera's steady hands at the well, into market to anyone who would listen. It was, briefly, the closest Chidera had come in her entire life to being spoken of with something other than fear. "Interesting," she said, loudly enough for the boy's mother to hear, "how the girl marked by a diviner's warning happened to be the one present when your son recovered. One does wonder what really happened in that house while the rest of us were sleeping." The suggestion was baseless, and everyone who thought about it for more than a moment could see it was baseless. But baseless suggestions, repeated often enough by a confident enough voice, rarely need to survive close examination to do their damage. Within the week, the boy's mother had stopped mentioning Chidera's name at all, and the brief window of goodwill closed as quickly as it had opened. Over the following months, Mama Adogo began teaching her properly which roots eased fever, which leaves closed a wound, which barks, boiled correctly, could ease the pain of childbirth. For the first time in Chidera's life, someone was looking at her not as a mark to be feared but as a mind worth investing in. "This one," Mama Adogo said one afternoon, holding up a bundle of pale, unremarkable-looking root, but crushed and boiled correctly. "It does more for a failing fever than half the more impressive-looking things people pay good money for." She glanced sideways at Chidera as she said it, and something in her tone suggested she wasn't only talking about the root. "You're saying that on purpose," Chidera said, the closest she'd come to teasing anyone in years. "I say most things on purpose," Mama Hadago replied, not quite smiling, but close to it. "It's a habit worth developing, if you intend to spend your life being underestimated by people who never bothered to look closely at anything." "Why are you kind to me?" Chidera asked once, unable to keep the question inside any longer, "when no one else in this village will even meet my eyes." Mama Adogo considered this for a long moment before answering. "Fear is contagious, but so is courage. Child, I have simply chosen which one I would rather carry. It costs me nothing to look at you plainly. I don't understand why it costs everyone else so much." For nearly a full season, Chidera allowed herself something she had not felt in years. Something almost like hope. Perhaps, she let herself think, there was a version of her life that didn't require permanent apology for existing. Perhaps healing, real skill, real purpose, might be the thing that finally let her step outside the shadow Dibia Okoro's words had cast over her entire childhood. It ended the way most good things in Chidera's life had learned to end. Adama, watching Mama Dago's growing closeness with the cursed girl with mounting suspicion, began telling anyone who'd listen that the traveling herbalist was clearly being deceived, or worse, bewitched, by whatever unnatural thing lived beneath that silver streak. When a customer's infant fell ill shortly after Mama Adogo had spent an afternoon teaching Chidera at her grandmother's stall, Adama made certain the timing was impossible to ignore. "An herbalist of your reputation," Adama said to Mama Adogo directly, in front of a gathered cluster of customers, her voice dripping with false concern. Spending so much time with a child, the diviner himself named, one does wonder what's rubbing off on whom. Mama Adogo defended Chidera, as long as she reasonably could. "I have examined this child's work myself," she said, sharper than her usual measured tone. Her hands are steadier and her instincts sounder than most healers twice her age. "If you have concerns about my judgment, Adama, you are welcome to bring them to me directly, rather than to every customer who passes your stall. But a traveling healer depends on trust to do her work at all, and trust, once poisoned in a small village, is nearly impossible to fully restore." Bookings quietly dried up. She left Endaya earlier than planned that season, promising to return, though something in her face when she said it told Chidera she understood exactly how unlikely that promise was to survive the village's memory of what Adama had done to her name. She did not return. Chidera watched the road for her anyway, for longer than she probably should have, before finally accepting that this door, like every other door in her life, had quietly closed behind her. The cruelty reached its true peak the year Chidera turned 17, when a drought settled over Nedia's farmland with a severity no one in the village could remember seeing in a generation. Crops failed, wells ran low, and a frightened village, exactly as it had done 8 years earlier with the fever deaths, began looking for somewhere to place blame that wasn't the simple, uncontrollable cruelty of weather. Adama did not even need to work particularly hard this time. The story had been building for so many years that it now moved almost entirely on its own momentum. By the time the village council convened beneath the Eudora tree to discuss what should be done about the drought, Chidera's name was already the first one spoken. Adama did not even need to work particularly hard this time. By the time the village council convened beneath the Eudora tree to discuss what should be done about the drought, Chidera's name was already the first one spoken. "The diviner warned us 8 years ago," one elder said. "We ignored him out of softness. Perhaps this is what softness costs a village. The wells were failing in 3 neighboring villages before ours," Mama Ninkoyo said. "Villages with no silver-haired girl among them at all. Will you blame the sky next, or only the easiest target standing in front of you?" A younger elder, one of the few who had never fully embraced the old suspicion, spoke up. "She has a point. The drought reaches farther than India's borders." And yet Adama cut in smoothly. "From her place near the front of the gathering, it is only in India that we have a child marked by a diviner of Dibia Okoro standing. Perhaps that is worth more consideration than convenient timing." The council murmured its agreement, fear-finding, as it usually does, exactly the reasoning it had already decided to believe before the discussion even began. Mama Nkoyo stood before the full council, her back straight, despite her age, and made the case she had been making, in one form or another, for 17 years. "This child has never once brought harm to India. She has only ever tried to belong to a village that decided, before she could speak a single word, that she never would. It was not enough. Fear, once it has fully taken hold of a frightened community, rarely listens to reason, however calmly or truthfully delivered." The council's verdict, when it came, was swift and nearly unanimous. Chidera would be escorted beyond India's borders within the week, for the safety and peace of the village. Exile. At 17, for the crime of having been born with the wrong-colored hair, this is the part of the story where I need you to stay with me, because everything that happens next is the reason this story exists at all. If you've made it this far, like this video right now, and tell me honestly in the comments, have you ever been blamed for something that was never actually your fault, simply because it was easier for everyone else than looking closer at the truth? Mama Nkoyo did not accept the council's decision quietly. She spent the following 2 days visiting every elder individually, reminding each of them of debts owed, kindnesses given, 17 years of quiet, good conduct that a single drought season seemed determined to erase entirely. None of it moved the verdict. Fear, once a village has fully committed to it, rarely bends for reminders of the very ordinariness it has chosen to forget. On the night before Chidera's exile was to begin, Mama Ninkoyo sat her granddaughter down by the fire, and the two of them worked in silence for a while, folding what few belongings Chidera would be permitted to carry into a single travel bundle, a task made harder by how little. In 17 years, either of them had ever been allowed to accumulate. "I keep thinking," Chidera said quietly, staring into the fire rather than at her grandmother, "that if I had just been born without it, without the silver, none of this would have happened. You would still have your customers, I would still have a home." "Do not do that," Mama Ninkoyo said, sharper than she'd intended, softening immediately after. "Do not spend your last night in this village apologizing for the shape you were born into. That is exactly the lie this village has spent 17 years teaching you, and I will not let you carry it out through the gate with you tomorrow." It was then, with nothing left to lose and her granddaughter's exile only hours away, that Mama Ninkoyo told her, for the first time in 17 years, a truth she had carried in careful silence since before Chidera was even born. "Your mother," Mama Ninkoyo said, her voice unsteady in a way Chidera had genuinely never heard before, "was not born in India. She came to me as an infant, carried by a frightened royal servant fleeing the capital during an uprising that nearly ended the ruling family of Oduma entirely. That servant made me swear never to tell a soul where the child came from, for her own safety. Your mother carried a mark exactly like yours, hidden beneath her scarves her whole life, exactly as you have hidden yours. I never told her the whole truth either, out of fear for what it might cost her. I have wondered every day since you were born with that same silver streak, whether my silence was protection or cowardice. Tonight, with nothing left to lose, I choose to stop wondering." Chidera sat in stunned silence, the fire crackling between them, trying to absorb 17 years of assumed truth, crumbling in the space of a single conversation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she finally asked. Not with anger, only genuine, exhausted confusion. "Because a secret like that, spoken carelessly in a village like this one, could have gotten you killed rather than exiled," Mama Ninkoyo said. "I judged, every year, that silence was the safer choice. Perhaps I judged wrong. I have had a great many years to wonder." "Where do I go, then?" Chidera finally asked, "if not simply out into exile with nowhere to belong." "Toward the capital," Mama Ninkoyo said. "Toward Oduma. If that mark means what I have always suspected it means, someone there will recognize it faster than any diviner in India ever bothered to understand it." The morning of the exile arrived, gray and ordinary, the way terrible mornings often do, with no particular weather to mark the occasion. A small escort of village men walked Chidera and her grandmother, who had refused, flatly and without discussion, to let her granddaughter leave alone, to the market square, the traditional gathering point before any traveler left India's borders for good. Chidera did not cry. She had promised herself the night before that she would not give the village that particular satisfaction, and she held to it, chin level, scarf deliberately loosened rather than pulled tight, the silver streak visible for the first time in years, as she walked past the same Udora tree where Dibia Okoro had once pronounced his verdict over her infant self. It was at the market's edge, escorts still forming around her, village elders still watching with the particular blankness of people who have decided not to examine their own decision too closely, that the sound of approaching horses first reached them. King Adigo of Oduma had ruled for 9 years, since his father's death, and in all that time, his great-aunt Princess Ugana, the only member of the royal family, old enough to remember the uprising that had nearly destroyed their line 3 decades earlier, had never once stopped searching for traces of the infant princess out of the palace on the worst night of her life. Princess Ifai, King Adiga's cousin, once removed, had been an infant when a faction within the palace guard rose against the royal family, killing her parents and coming within hours of eliminating the entire bloodline. A single loyal servant had escaped with the infant princess into the chaos of that night and vanished completely. And despite decades of searching, no trace of either the servant or the child had ever been found. The one thing everyone who remembered Princess Ifai agreed on, the detailed Princess Ugana had never stopped describing to anyone who would listen across 30 years of fruitless searching, was the single streak of silver-white hair. The infant princess, had been born with a mark that had, according to the oldest royal records, appeared exactly 7 times across 400 years of the Oduma bloodline, always without warning, always carried by a direct royal descendant. Princess Ugana had been traveling with the king's convoy toward Ndea's district that season for an unrelated matter of regional tax assessment when her carriage passed through the village's market square in the wind, entirely by accident, lifted the headscarf of a girl selling herbs at a modest roadside stall. She was down from her palanquin before she had fully processed what she'd seen, moving faster than a woman of her years had any business moving, her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at a streak of silver hair she had spent 3 decades beginning to believe she would never see again in her lifetime. The market around them had gone completely silent, the same silence Ndea had directed at Chidera her entire life, though for an entirely different reason now. 30 armed guards in a royal palanquin had a way of commanding attention that a whispered curse never quite matched. "Say your mother's name," she said. "Say it na." Child Chidera, frozen at the center of a market square, gone completely silent around her, could barely make her voice work at all. "My mother's name was Adaze," she managed. "She died the night I was born. I never knew her." Princess Ugana's knees buckled. A guard caught her before she reached the ground, but she waved him off almost immediately, straightening herself with the fierce, stubborn dignity of a woman who had waited 30 years for exactly this moment, and refused to spend it, collapsed in the dust. "Adaze," she repeated, tears already running freely down a face that had, according to every account Chidera would later hear, not cried in public in decades. "That was the name my niece gave her infant daughter. The night the servant fled the palace with her, I was told for 30 years that both of them had died somewhere on the road. I mourned a child. I never once stopped hoping was still alive." Mamenkoyo arrived at the market square minutes later, having heard the commotion from her stall, and found her granddaughter standing at the center of a royal convoy with a princess of Oduma weeping before her in the open street. She said nothing for a long moment, simply taking in 17 years' worth of careful secrecy, finally, irreversibly, out in the open. Word reached King Adigo by rider within the hour, and by the time he arrived in Ndia himself 2 days later, the village that had voted to exile Chidera less than a week earlier found itself instead hosting the king of Odu, who walked directly to Mama Nkoyo's modest stall and knelt before the old woman, in full view of the entire, stunned village. The king's convoy had arrived at dawn, banners and outriders filling a market square that had, only days before, gathered in that same space to vote a 17-year-old girl out of the only home she had ever known. The same elders who had pronounced her exile now stood frozen at the edges of the crowd, visibly recalculating, in real time, exactly how badly they had misjudged the situation. "At cost to yourself, I cannot begin to fully understand. In a village that repaid your courage with cruelty toward the very child you saved. Oduma owes you a debt it can never fully repay." Mama Nkoyo, who had spent 17 years absorbing every insult Ndia had aimed at her granddaughter without once bending, found herself, for perhaps the first time in Chidra's memory, entirely without words. "I only did what any grandmother would do," she finally managed. "Then Oduma is fortunate." Thinking sighed that so few grandmothers were ever tested the way you were. He turned then to Chidera herself. Quietly cancelled, somewhere in the chaos of royal arrival. "I understand this is a great deal to absorb in a very short time," he said, more gently than his formal bearing had suggested he might. "You owe this kingdom nothing yet, and no explanation for needing time to understand what has happened to you. But when you are ready, Oduma would very much like to know its lost princess." "I don't know how to be a princess," Chidera said, the first fully honest thing she'd said aloud since the market had gone silent 2 days earlier. "I know how to grind herbs, and weave cloth, and stay small enough not to be noticed. I don't know anything else." Neither did my own grandmother. When she first came to court from a farming village, not so different from this one, Princess Ugana said, stepping forward to take Chidra's hand. "Royalty is not a skill you're born already knowing, child, whatever the storybooks claim. It is only, in the end, another thing you learn, the same as grinding herbs or weaving cloth. And you strike me as someone who has never once failed to learn a difficult thing when she set her mind to it." Adama, watching from the edge of the crowd, said nothing at all. relentless cruelty, genuinely nothing left for her to say. Divya, Okoro's fate, and Adamas were left in Chidera's hands, exactly as Princess Yugana gently insisted they should be. Since it was Chidera's exile they had orchestrated in Chidera's childhood, they had spent 17 years poisoning. Chidera did not ask for punishment beyond a public accounting before the full village council, the same council that had voted to exile her the week before, now compelled to hear, in complete and documented detail, exactly how a diviner's fear and one woman's grudge had shaped the persecution of a child who had done nothing wrong at all. "I do not want revenge," Chidera told the assembled village, standing now in fine traveling robes rather than the worn cloth she'd grown up in. "I want India to understand what fear, left unexamined, can do to a person who never asked for any of it. That is the only justice I need." She was brought to the capital within the month, and Princess Yugana, who had no children of her own, took to Chidera's education and formal introduction to court life with the fierce devotion of a woman determined not to lose a second chance at family she'd once believed gone forever. Chidera struggled, at first, the way anyone would, adjusting to palace life after 17 years of learning to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible. She flinched at formal titles. She found herself, some nights, oddly missing the quiet rhythm of grinding herbs at her grandmother's market stall, the one place in India where her hands, at least, had always been welcome. Mama Nkoyo came to live at the palace with her, at Chidera's absolute insistence, and spent her final years finally free of the quiet, grinding poverty that 17 years of village suspicion had imposed on both of them. She died peacefully 6 years later, in a proper bed, in a warm room, with her granddaughter, by then formally recognized as heir to the throne of Oduma Holdima, her hand exactly as she had once held Chidera's on countless frightened nights in India. "You were right," Chidera told her, in those final days, about the hair. "It was never other people's business." "I was right about more than that," Mama Nkoyo said, managing a faint, tired smile, since it took the whole kingdom to prove it. Chidera's formal coronation, held 2 years after Mama Nkoyo's death, once Princess Yugana judged her ready to rule in her own right, was attended by nobles from every corner of Oduma, and at Chidera's own quiet insistence. The same council of elders who had once voted for her exile, now standing in the front rows of a ceremony crowning her queen. She did not humiliate them. She simply let them watch, in full public view, exactly what the village had so nearly thrown away. Dibia Okoro was not among the delegation. He had died 2 winters earlier, in a neighboring district, still practicing his trade, still delivering pronouncements that other frightened villages accepted without question. When the news reached her, less anger than a kind of tired sadness for however many other children his careless words might have marked before hers. The coronation itself was held beneath open sky, in keeping with old Oduma tradition, so that the whole gathered crowd could see clearly when the royal crown, a slender circlet of beaten gold, deliberately designed centuries earlier to sit low across the forehead rather than hide the hairline the way heavier crowns, was placed over Chidera's head, the silver streak left entirely uncovered beneath it, visible to every person present. It was, Princess Yugana told her afterward, a deliberate choice on the crownmaker's part, made generations before either of them were born. Back when the mark still appeared regularly enough in the bloodline that early Oduma rulers had wanted their crowns to display it, rather than conceal it, as final, unmistakable proof to any doubting subject exactly who stood before them. They knew, even then, Princess Yugana said, that the mark was never something to hide. It only became something worth hiding once fear got hold of people who had forgotten what it actually meant. You have simply returned it to what it always was. 10 years later, India tells a very different story about the silver-haired girl than the one it told when she was a child. The diviner's warning is rarely repeated anymore, and when it is, it's usually followed by an uncomfortable silence rather than agreement. Obina, the boy who had once refused to drink from Chidera's water gourd at 6 years old, was among the villagers, waiting quietly at the edge of the crowd during one of her annual visits. Now a grown man with children of his own. He did not approach her directly. Shame, it seemed, had kept him at the edges of most gatherings involving her since the day the king's convoy first arrived. But when their eyes met, briefly across the market square, he inclined his head in something that might have been an apology to decades too late. Chidera inclined hers back. She had long since decided that carrying every old grievance forward with her would leave no room for anything else, and she found, standing now in the same market square where she'd once silently rinsed a dropped water gourd alone, that she meant the gesture sincerely. Dibia Okoro, informed years later of exactly whose life his careless pronouncement had shaped, sent no apology and made no public correction. Some people, it turns out, are constitutionally incapable of admitting the weight of their own words, even decades after the damage is done. Chidera chose, in the end, not to pursue the matter further. Some reckonings, she decided, weren't worth the energy required to demand them. Adama left the village not long after Chidera's departure, unable to bear the weight of what the whole village now quietly understood about the years of cruelty she had orchestrated. She was not formally punished. Chidera had asked for none of that but the particular, specific shame of being publicly known as the architect of a stolen princess's suffering proved, in the end, its own quiet consequence. Never having married, choosing instead to rule in her own right, as the bloodline's rightful heir still keeps her hair uncovered these days. The silver streak worn openly, deliberately, where anyone can see it. Is it true? A young palace servant asked her once, working up the courage after months of quiet observation, that they called you cursed for this, where you grew up. They did, Chidera said. For 17 years, and I believed them for most of it. Because it is very hard not to believe something the whole world keeps telling you about yourself. What changed your mind? An old woman who never once treated my strangeness as a weakness, even when it would have been easier for her to look away like everyone else. That, and the truth. When it finally caught up to the fear that had been outrunning it my whole life, the truth is patient. It always arrives eventually, even when we've stopped believing it's coming. She still visits NDA once a year, unannounced, in plain traveling clothes, sitting with the poorest families of the village that once voted to cast her out, listening more than she speaks, remembering without bitterness. The girl who once hid her own hair out of fear of a truth she hadn't yet been given the chance to understand. On these visits, she makes a point of stopping first at the Eudora tree in the market square, the same tree where a diviner once pointed a 9-year-old girl toward 17 years of fear. And now, where village children gather freely around a queen who kneels to their eye level and asks them, without exception, what makes each of them different from everyone else around them, and tells them, before they've even finished answering, that whatever it is theirs and no one else's business. It is, she has told Princess Ugana's memory more than once, the only inheritance she ever truly wanted to pass on. A mark feared in ignorance is the same mark honored in truth.